Oh boy. So I never thought that in asking you for your garden planning questions, I would open such a can of worms. The amount of overwhelm just seeping through the questions that you guys gave me, it's seriously like, I gotta fix this. So by the end of this video, you're not gonna be overwhelmed by the idea of garden planning anymore. We're gonna address all of your questions about garden planning. I've got a big list here. Some stuff I've never answered before that I think it would be really good to have all in one place as you're getting going and getting into your garden planning. We did already go over my garden layouts, which is in a past video in the garden planning playlist that you can check out, and the kind of system that I use there. That will help you a lot as you're dealing with that overwhelm. But I think we should just kind of get right into it because there's a lot to cover here. First question is, how do watering systems factor into my garden planning? I think that is a very important integral part of your garden planning. It's probably one of the first things on your checklist that you should look at is what kind of irrigation do you have access to, whether that's physically in the space or financially and what you can afford, because that's going to dictate a lot of what your layout may end up being. If you have Oyas in the bed, for example, that kind of takes up some amount of space depending on the size of them. If you have drip, like you're a little bit more flexible, but also just keeping in mind the location of your garden beds in relation to your water source. Like if you have your garden beds 100 feet away from the spigot off of your house, how is that water getting to the raised beds? So definitely something to keep in mind as you're starting the garden planning process. If you're literally starting from the very beginning, especially, and you're trying to decide where to put your beds, knowing where you have access to water is really important. Where do I get my plant pots? So we're talking about, I'm guessing, seed starting here. You don't have to start your own seeds to start a garden. You can definitely just grab whatever you find at your local nursery. There's some really great mail order options, but if you are starting seeds, I have 2 seed starting companies that I recommend, primarily because the plastic is really durable. So if you're going to be starting seeds in plastic, you want it to be something that's going to last a really long time and also has air pruning slots in it, because that's going to help keep your roots from circling and just give you stronger, healthier root systems. So look for something like this. I really like it when they have the hole in the bottom, because you can just kind of pop up your seedling when you want to take it out without disturbing the roots quite as much. It's a little bit easier because you don't really have to grip as much if you have like a physical limitation in that way, like I do. But I will link to these and the other company that I love down below. How do you choose what to plant in each space? I kind of get into this a little bit more in the garden layout video that I was talking about. For me, it really boils down to a process of elimination. So we're starting at the top of the hierarchy in terms of the largest plants that are going to take up the most space. The plants that maybe compete with others, have allelopathic tendencies where they excrete stuff into the soil that makes it harder for the things around it to grow. We need to know where the plants that have the most limitations have to be, and then kind of work our way down the list of everything that we're planting. But you also need to keep in mind daylight hours. When you're choosing what to plant in each space, it's really important to make a note of, like, if that's a crop that really needs a lot of heat, a lot of sun, or prefers cool weather, like lettuce. Say you've got squash, you've got tomatoes, you've got cucumbers, and you have lettuce. The squash, those are going to be the biggest. I usually put them on the outside edges of the bed, and I start with those because they're really large and they can really only go in one place in my mind. So that takes up our corners of the beds. The tomatoes, I'm probably going to put right in the center of the bed, because then I can surround it more easily with things like companion plants that might keep away hornworms, such as marigolds. It just kind of protects it and creates a physical barrier with the squash. The cucumbers, we know, have to be grown vertically. We need to put them in a space that has room for a trellis. And then with our lettuce, we can actually utilize the shade that we've created with the cucumbers to give them a cooler, shadier area to grow in, which is what they prefer. So that's why I'm saying, like, start with your list of everything that you need to grow. And then by process of elimination, just start knocking things off those lists and assigning them to different sections of the garden. Which kind of brings us to our next question, which is, where do I start? We've got kind of a hierarchy of things that we need to do first. We need to assess our location. So you're assessing for weather extremes, you're assessing for sunlight and shade, you're assessing for how much drainage the area has, or if a lot of standing water tends to sit in it. Then you're gonna make a list of everything you want to grow in a perfect world. Sky's the limit at this point. You're just making a big old list. Then you're gonna type grow zone plus your zip code into Google, and you're gonna find out what your grow zone is. Then you're gonna go back to that dream list you created and you're gonna cross off anything, Googling as you go, that doesn't grow in your climate, in your grow zone. Next, you move into the garden layout process. So we've got our layout done, and then you can start scheduling out when you need to plant seed starts, when you need to transplant things into the garden itself, which comes back to, again, Googling your zip code plus last frost date so you know when your last frost date is and just working backwards from that. And that is really all there is to it, to starting the garden. That's all you need to do. And I have lots of videos walking you through that in more depth throughout the channel. I'm filling new beds this year. Can I use junk dirt for the bottom and compost for the top? You could definitely do this, but it depends on the depth of your beds, okay? So we want to have at least 3 inches of really good compost and organic matter on the top level surface of the soil to kind of give our seedlings a head start while they're first getting established. So it doesn't matter so much if there's junk soil lower down, as long as the bed is about 12 inches deep. If your bed is, say, I want to say 8 inches is another really common size that I see in raised beds. It's a little bit more risky. I would think you're already asking the plant roots to kind of work harder because there's less depth to the bed, and so we're making it even harder by using really low quality dirt. And it is going to depend on the depth of your bed and what you're growing. If it's something really nutrient dense, something that requires a lot of nitrogen. Should tomatoes and hot peppers be separated? If so, how far? Anything that's in the same family is going to compete for nutrients in a space. So if you have a 4x4 garden bed and you plant tomatoes and peppers in that same bed, there's a couple of things that can happen. First of all, they're competing for those nutrients. Second of all, you're increasing the likelihood that pests that would be attracted to something in the nightshade family are going to be attracted to both of those plants. That being said, a lot of my beds are 2 feet by 8 feet long, and I have planted tomatoes within a foot of a pepper plant, and both have been fine. It really depends on how committed you are to a fertilization schedule, which I fertilize my garden every 2 to 3 weeks, and what other measures you have in place to mitigate those pests that are going to be drawn to both of those plants, which I do a lot of companion planting of like basil and marigolds and things that repel the stuff that likes nightshade. Now, if your bed is hit with a disease, both of those plants are going to be affected. Whereas if you had had your tomatoes and peppers in separate beds, you might be able to save one or the other. So it's not so much with garden planning that there's these hard and fast rules that if you don't follow them, you're going to fail completely. You just have to know what your comfort level is with the risks, keeping in mind why. The reason that people tell you to do or not to do certain things in the garden. And that's a big part of what I'm trying to teach you guys here is I want you to feel empowered to make those decisions for yourself. I'm never going to outright tell you never plant peppers and tomatoes together. I'm going to tell you the reason why you might not want to so you can make that decision for yourself. How and when should I start reviving my winterized plants? I guess I'm not really sure what is meant by reviving here. I'm going to go off of the assumption that you've kind of mulched a perennial or something. And if it's native to your zone and you've put a little layer of leaves over it to insulate it or something like that, the plant's going to revive itself. It's going to revive itself at the right moment in time based on the number of daylight hours it senses that it's receiving, based on the overnight temperatures and the averages that it's feeling in its root system. It's going to wake itself up. So once things start to warm up a little bit, probably within like 1 to 2 weeks of your last frost date, start pulling that mulch away every day and just checking for signs of life. If you see those signs of life, you can definitely pull that mulch off and just let it kind of do its thing. A lot of what I feel like people get hung up on in gardening and getting started is this idea that we have to intervene in order for the plants to be successful. And I think the best gardeners and the most experienced gardeners come to realize that it's a lot more about listening to the signs that nature is giving us and working with nature and not against it. So I thought this question was a really good example of that, because there's this idea that we can do something, and realistically, there's not a heck of a lot you can do. I don't know if this person was referring to a specific plant here. They didn't specify a plant, but overall, if a plant is overwintering, it's perennial in your zone for how cold your climate gets, then it's gonna know. It's gonna know when to wake up and it's gonna tell you. So paying attention to those signs and really tuning into the sensory outputs that nature is giving us will be really empowering as you're kind of getting used to like when things are waking up and what you should do to help them. How do I not get overwhelmed? I genuinely got this question multiple times. And I think I've already sort of addressed like you're gonna do X, Y, Z. But I do also want to say that so much of why I think we get overwhelmed in garden planning is because we don't understand how our own brains work, right? Like I can show you my garden layout and you can still feel overwhelmed by it because for the way you process information and take in new ideas and the way that you express creativity, it may not work because I'm a very type A organized person. I love grids, I love lists, I love spreadsheets. That is me and that works for me. So I would say at the core of it, on top of just kind of trusting nature to do her thing and working with nature, not against it, we also need to kind of assess how our brains work and how we best process information because you're gonna find there's a million different start a garden ebooks and courses and videos out there for you. But unless that particular content aligns with the way that your brain works, it's not gonna ease your overwhelm at all. So really spend some time like deep diving on different garden content creators and find one that feels like it resonates with you. Like if there's parts of the way that my brain work that you can relate to, then the way I plan my garden will probably work very well for you for easing that overwhelm. But then there's people like I've had many people with ADHD who tell me like the way I plan a garden gives them panic attacks. So, and that's fine. Like everybody's brain is different. How can I start a garden on a budget? I always say that you can start a garden in a 5-gallon pot. Like you really don't need a lot. You can use a $3 pot from your Home Depot. It does not matter. Stuff's gonna grow, and even if it doesn't, you're gonna learn something. If you're consuming garden content on the internet, I feel like it's really easy to get into the comparison game, just like we do with any other content creation on the internet. A lot of my gardens are not financially accessible to everyone all of the time because I work with brands, I test products for them, it's part of my job. All you need is a pot of dirt. That's all you need. It really is all you need. I would call that a garden for sure. But in terms of practical measures you can take if you're trying to start a larger scale garden, we're gonna be getting into more of the budget elements of it when we do Roxanne's garden install. We do the dog-friendly garden in New Jersey in May. But really just stick with the simplest materials that you can find. You can repurpose all sorts of things. It's just a matter of getting creative. Like plants want to live, they truly do. And so while it's nice to be able to invest in really high quality soils and fertilizers and plants, like a seed packet can be $3. There's plenty of seed exchanges in communities that you can kind of find and be a part of on Facebook groups and things like that. When do I fertilize? So before you start thinking about fertilizing your garden, I want you to really narrow in on what your garden is going to be in terms of if it's a raised bed, if it's in ground, if it's containers, if you're growing things that are really nutrient demanding like tomatoes, for example, those things are going to dictate how often you need to fertilize. I fertilize every 2 to 3 weeks because the majority of my gardens are in elevated raised beds, which means they're really more like container gardens. They don't have access to the soil in the ground. So they don't have access to that same microbiome. And it's much easier for the nutrients to become depleted, especially because I'm growing vegetables, which in general are just much hungrier plants than like flowers. If you're growing flowers, it's a totally different game. It also depends what kind of fertilizer you want to do. Are you doing a foliar feed? Are you doing granular plant food, which is what I usually do? So it's hard to give you one specific answer to that question, but I can give you those other questions to kind of ask yourself in order to assess what your garden is going to need. So just kind of keeping in mind the nutrient demands of your specific scenario. Which raised beds are your favorite? You have so many different ones. That is definitely one of the perks of the job. I get to test a lot of different elevated beds. So they're not raised beds in the traditional sense. They don't touch the ground. They're contained and they're elevated. So they're usually about waist height. And that has a lot of different benefits. I really can't speak to any other styles of raised beds, but I have tested 3 going on 4 different elevated raised beds, and they all have different pros and cons based on assembly, cost, longevity, appearance. I will link to all of my raised beds down below. For appearance and ease of use, I would say the gardener's beds that I have. For ease of assembly and value for your money, I would say the Epic beds. If you're really strapped for cash, but you still want an elevated option that maybe won't last as long, I really like the Veg Trugs as well, but they're definitely toward the bottom of the list for me. And I'm going to be testing out in the greenhouse some new metal ones that I'm really excited about, because I feel like that's going to end up being the best of all worlds. Like, they're so durable. The jury's still out on those ones. I don't keep anything in my garden that I absolutely dislike. There's just certain pros and cons of each one of the different styles that I use that, based on what's important to you, kind of might dictate which option you want to go with. So I couldn't tell you like the top tier number 1. Best plants for beginner gardeners. I always say start with an herb garden because you can do it in a really small space. They're pretty self-sufficient and easy to grow, and they also give you the biggest bang for your buck because herbs are so expensive in the store. Once people start branching outside of herbs, I feel like they automatically go to tomatoes, which can be a really negative first gardening experience because they can be a little bit tricky. Like, they do have aggressive pest issues with hornworms. They have aggressive disease issues with blight that can be really hard to prevent. If you're starting them from seed, it's easy for them to get leggy and hard to know when to pot them up. So it's not my first choice for beginners, although I can understand why people would get excited about it. Just go into it with the assumption that it might not work out perfectly your first year. I would start with leafy greens. Like, lettuce is super easy. Definitely no brassicas, just because the cabbage white butterflies are going to ruin your life and you'll never want to garden again. So my recommendation for beginner plants is generally based less on what you're most excited to grow and what is going to be the most foolproof, so you have a positive experience and you're ready and your emotions are bolstered to try something a little bit harder that might not go as well. What visual planning apps do you recommend? So I think this is coming from, I've shown in a few of my videos, like me working on my iPad. You can use a pen and paper. It really doesn't matter. For me, I change things a lot as I'm planning, so I find it very annoying to have to be erasing things on paper, and using the iPad with Procreate, I think, is the best way to do it. It's not the cheapest way to do it if you don't have an iPad, but that's the method that I think they're asking me about. Like, I do generally use an iPad. You can also use Canva. It's very powerful now. It gives you the ability to draw all sorts of things. If you want like a starting point, my freebie with the garden planning layouts, I will link down in the description, has 3 or 4 different garden grids that you can kind of play around with to give you a starting point to work on if you want to pull those into Canva. How do I know how much soil I need? There's calculators online. I am terrible at math and I never trust myself to do this myself. I think Gardener Supply has a calculator, but I just Google like soil calculator, and that will tell you like in cubic feet typically how much you need. If you need a really large amount, it's usually better to get it in bulk from a landscaping company. However, there's a lot of issues with that, and I've personally had issues where the quality was not up to par. So typically if I'm filling a raised bed from scratch, I will get a pallet of Coast of Maine, which is a huge investment, not a budget option at all. I just can't personally risk it in my garden to get a 50-50 compost and loam mix from a landscaping company when I've had issues with it in the past. The last batch that I got had grubs in it. It's way cheaper, and it also saves you all the plastic waste, which I know is really important to a lot of us, but it's risky. It's very risky unless you have like a dedicated like garden center nursery that will deliver it. I wouldn't recommend getting it from just any old landscaping company. How do I prep soil for planting? So again, this is going to depend on if you're starting a garden from scratch or if you're kind of revitalizing it for the spring. But typically what I do is, I mean, the plants eat up soil. If you're working in an established raised bed, you probably lost 2 or 3 inches anyway. And I try to top that off with just straight compost or just a really high quality potting soil that has a lot of organic matter in it. And I also add, just to get it started, a lot of granular plant food. But I would say like bare minimum, you've got your layer of kind of topsoil, and then you want 3 inches of compost on that. And you can kind of rake it in so it's not just like straight compost. Depending on the brand that you get, Sometimes planting new starts directly into straight compost can burn them because it's like way too much nitrogen at once. The Coast and Main stuff that I use, you can plant directly in it because it's very gentle, but it depends on what type of soil that you get. Do you incorporate tool storage into your garden planning? I think you definitely should. Like if you don't have a dedicated shed already, adding kind of like a toolbox to your garden area will make it so much easier, because otherwise like tools get scattered around everywhere. Like it is so hard to keep track of these things. So planning for that in advance is something that you'll be thanking your past self for sure. I can't decide whether to grow in ground or in raised beds. What should I do? So if you have really good in-ground soil, and by that I mean it's not rock hard, it's not straight clay, it's not straight sand, so you don't really have to amend it at all, and you don't have physical limitations that might prevent you from the strenuous bending and kneeling that you need to do for in-ground gardening. In-ground gardening is the path of least resistance. Like it's the cheapest, it's the most accessible for a lot of us. If you're dealing with any sort of challenge with your soil, with your physical ability, a raised bed, it just makes it a lot easier. Of course, there's an additional cost because we're not just prepping the ground. We have to fill a surface that's probably about 12 inches deep, and we have to build it or we have to buy it. But I prefer raised beds. I will say, if I add any more beds to my garden, I will do hugelkultur, because it's basically an elevated bed but utilizing nature. So it's like this big mound that you kind of start building off with sticks and brush and even tree trunks. And then as the layers go up, like it becomes more just straight dirt. And so this is a permaculture method you can look into. I'm not going to get into it in super depth right now, but I would say if I were starting over and I had the physical ability to make the hugelkultur mounds, I would probably do that because it's the cheapest, it's the best for the environment. It creates strong, healthy, thriving plants because of the way that it holds water and heat in. It's just all around an excellent, excellent technique. So I guess my answer between raised beds or in ground is neither. I would say hugelkultur, otherwise raised beds, and then third would be in ground. But that's based on my own kind of biases and limitations. Like, again, you need to find gardeners who are giving advice that resonates with your lifestyle, the way your brain works, the situation that you're in. And I think that is a big part of why people get so overwhelmed. Now with the internet, like we have access to all this information, which is incredible. But if you're getting it in these 60-second blips on Instagram and TikTok or whatever you're on, it does just become overwhelming, like information overload, and it becomes really hard to discern what information is relevant to you and what isn't, which is a big part of why I love talking on YouTube a lot more, because I get to just really explain myself. It's not like the 80s where you would just go to the library, get a book on vegetable gardening and start a garden, or your neighbor would come over and show you what to do. Like, we have a million neighbors now on the internet, and they all think that their way is the best way, and it may very well be the best way for them, but that doesn't mean it's the best way for you. And I think discerning that is the best way to eliminate the majority of that overwhelm. So I really hope that this helped, but if you have any additional garden planning questions, please put them in the comments down below and I'll make sure to get to them. And don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button so you don't miss any future videos like this one. Thanks for gardening with me, and I'll see you next time.